He thought humiliating her in court would be easy, but he had no idea he had just set the stage for his own undoing. The courtroom in downtown Chicago gleamed under rows of fluorescent lights, the polished wooden benches filled with quiet observers who had come expecting a routine hearing, not a lesson in humility. Judge Richard Holloway adjusted his black robe with deliberate precision, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a man accustomed to absolute control, the kind of control that made people lower their voices and avoid eye contact. At the center of it all stood Emily Carter, a woman in her late 30s, dressed in a simple navy cardigan and modest slacks, her posture calm but unremarkable, the kind of presence that faded into the background without effort. To most people in that room, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place, someone who didn't belong under the weight of legal authority and sharp-tongued attorneys. And that was exactly what Judge Holloway believed. He leaned forward slightly, tapping his pen against the bench with a rhythm that echoed faintly through the silent room, a subtle signal that he was about to begin his performance. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to draw attention, "I trust you understand the seriousness of representing yourself today." A few heads turned, and a quiet murmur rippled through the gallery, the kind of reaction that fed his confidence. Emily lifted her gaze, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable, and gave a small nod. It wasn't defiance, not yet, but it wasn't submission either. The distinction was so subtle that most people missed it, but it lingered in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Judge Holloway's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, the kind reserved for moments when he believed he held every advantage. He had seen this before. People stepping into his courtroom thinking they could navigate a system they barely understood, only to crumble under pressure. Today, he intended to make an example out of her, to remind everyone watching exactly who held the power in this room. The attorneys at the side table exchanged quick glances, one of them suppressing a smirk as he shuffled his papers, clearly expecting an easy outcome. Even the court clerk avoided looking directly at Emily, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if bracing for what was about to unfold. The atmosphere tightened, anticipation building not from excitement, but from the quiet certainty that something uncomfortable was about to happen. And yet, Emily didn't move. She didn't fidget or glance around for reassurance. Instead, she adjusted the stack of documents in her hands with precise, almost practiced movements, aligning each page as if every detail mattered. It was a small gesture, nearly invisible in a room filled with judgment, but it carried a weight that hadn't revealed itself yet. Judge Holloway noticed it, just for a fraction of a second, and then dismissed it entirely. To him, she was just another unprepared individual stepping into a system designed to overwhelm. But what he didn't realize, what no one in that room could possibly see, was that Emily Carter wasn't here to survive this moment. She was here to change it. And in a matter of minutes, the quiet woman standing alone at that table would turn the very structure of that courtroom against the man who believed he controlled it. The room held its breath, though no one knew why yet. Emily Carter had not always been invisible, though the people in that courtroom would have found that difficult to believe as they watched her stand quietly at the defense table, her simple appearance blending into the background of polished wood and authority. Years earlier, long before she ever stepped into a public school classroom, Emily had sat in lecture halls filled with some of the brightest legal minds in the country, her notebooks filled with meticulous notes, her professors often pausing mid-lecture to acknowledge the precision of her questions. But life had not followed the path others expected for her, and instead of courtrooms and corporate law firms, she had chosen a quieter life, one that allowed her to focus on teaching, on guiding students who needed patience more than prestige. That decision, however, had not erased what she knew. It had only buried it beneath years of deliberate simplicity. In the present moment, Judge Holloway cleared his throat, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension that had settled over the room, and began outlining the case with a tone that carried both authority and subtle condescension, emphasizing each point as if explaining something obvious to someone who could not possibly keep up. The details were presented quickly, almost too quickly, as though speed itself would overwhelm her, as though the sheer weight of legal language would force her into confusion. A few people in the gallery leaned forward, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty, expecting the small cracks that would confirm the judge's assumption. Instead, Emily listened. She did not interrupt. She did not react. Her eyes followed each word, her expression calm, her breathing steady, absorbing everything with a focus that seemed out of place for someone supposedly unprepared. The opposing attorney, a man in his early 40s with a tailored suit and a practiced smile, began to present his argument with confidence, occasionally glancing toward Emily with a faint look of amusement, as if he had already decided the outcome before speaking a single sentence. He spoke in polished phrases, referencing statutes and procedures, his tone smooth but slightly exaggerated, designed not just to persuade the judge, but to remind the room of his expertise. A soft chuckle slipped from somewhere in the back when he paused dramatically, and though it was quickly stifled, it lingered just long enough to underline the imbalance in the room. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, her fingers resting on the edge of her documents, and for a moment, it looked as though she might shrink into the silence, as though the weight of expectation might finally press her down. But then something shifted, almost imperceptibly. Her hand moved with quiet certainty, turning a page, aligning another, her eyes scanning lines of text not with confusion, but with recognition. Judge Holloway noticed again, just a flicker of attention, but once more he dismissed it, convinced that whatever composure she displayed was nothing more than surface-level calm. He leaned back, slightly, folding his hands, and allowed the attorney to continue, already preparing the next question that would corner her, that would expose the limits of her understanding in front of everyone watching. The room settled into a tense rhythm, the kind that builds before a decisive moment, though no one could yet identify what that moment would be. And still, Emily Carter said nothing, her silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate, just long enough to suggest that she was not waiting for permission to speak, but for the exact moment when it would matter most. Judge Holloway allowed the final words of the opposing attorney to hang in the air for a moment, as if the silence itself confirmed the strength of the argument. Then he turned his gaze back to Emily Carter with a measured expression that carried both impatience and expectation. He tapped his pen once more, slower this time, deliberate, as though signaling that her moment had arrived and that it would not last long. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone sharpened just enough to draw every eye in the room back to her. "You have heard the argument presented. I suggest you respond clearly and concisely, so we do not waste the court's time." A faint ripple of amusement passed through the gallery, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that thrived on imbalance, on the assumption that what came next would confirm what everyone already believed. Emily lifted her head, her movements unhurried, her posture unchanged, and for a brief second, she said nothing. The pause stretched just long enough to make the judge's expression tighten slightly, just enough to make the attorney shift his weight with quiet confidence, certain that hesitation meant defeat. Then Emily spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and unexpectedly clear, carrying across the room without force, without strain, yet commanding attention in a way that did not rely on volume. "Your Honor," she began, her tone respectful but precise. "Before I respond, I would like to clarify a procedural detail regarding the sequence of the argument presented." The attorney's smile flickered, just slightly, as if he had not anticipated that opening, and Judge Holloway leaned forward, his brows narrowing in mild irritation. "Proceed," he said, though the word carried a hint of dismissal, as if granting permission to a point he already expected to dismantle. Emily glanced down at her documents, then back up, her eyes steady as she continued. "The argument references Section 4.2 of the Municipal Code as its primary basis, but the interpretation presented omits a qualifying clause that directly affects the application in this case." A few heads in the gallery tilted, curiosity replacing amusement, while the attorney's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "The clause," Emily continued, her voice unwavering, "specifies that enforcement under this section requires prior written notice delivered within a defined timeframe, which, according to the records submitted, did not occur." The room shifted, the quiet deepening, the earlier murmurs dissolving into focused attention. Judge Holloway's pen stilled against the bench, his gaze sharpening as he looked down at the documents before him, then back at Emily. "Are you suggesting," he said slowly, "that the court has overlooked a procedural requirement?" Emily did not flinch. I am stating that the requirement exists, Your Honor, and that its absence affects the validity of the argument presented. The attorney cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly, his confidence no longer effortless. Your Honor, the interpretation of that clause, he began, but Emily spoke again, not interrupting, but entering the space with a precision that redirected the focus entirely. The interpretation has been addressed in prior cases, she said, her tone still calm, still measured, including Davis versus City Council, where the court determined that failure to provide proper notice invalidated enforcement under identical circumstances. The name of the case settled into the room like a sudden shift in gravity. Judge Holloway's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those paying close attention, his earlier certainty replaced by something more cautious, more deliberate. The attorney's prepared rhythm faltered, his eyes flicking briefly toward the judge, then back to Emily, as if recalibrating in real time. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the room, not loud, not obvious, but undeniable. The quiet woman who had stood alone at that table was no longer being watched with amusement. She was being listened to. The room went still. The silence that followed Emily Carter's last words did not feel empty. It felt heavy, as if the entire courtroom had shifted its weight at once and was waiting to see where it would settle. Judge Holloway did not speak immediately, which in itself was unusual, his reputation built on swift, decisive control, not hesitation. He lowered his gaze to the documents in front of him, flipping a page with deliberate care, his earlier confidence now tempered by a need to verify what he had just heard. The faint scratching of paper echoed softly, the only sound breaking the stillness. Across the aisle, the opposing attorney straightened his posture, forcing a composed expression back onto his face, though the ease he carried earlier had begun to fracture. Your Honor, he began, his voice measured but no longer effortless. The reference to Davis versus City Council is not directly applicable in this context, as the circumstances differ in material ways. His words were precise, but there was a subtle urgency beneath them now, a need to regain footing. Emily did not react immediately. She allowed his statement to settle, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her gaze steady, patient. Then she responded, not louder, not sharper, but with a clarity that cut through the room. The circumstances differ in context, but not in procedural requirement, she said. The court in that case specifically addressed the necessity of proper notice as a condition of enforcement, regardless of situational variation. The attorney opened his mouth to reply, but paused, recalculating, his confidence no longer automatic. Judge Holloway looked up again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Emily with a new level of attention, no longer dismissing her as unprepared. Ms. Carter, he said slowly, are you asserting that the procedural deficiency alone is sufficient to invalidate the enforcement action? Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the question. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her tone unwavering. Because without proper notice, the enforcement lacks the legal foundation required under the statute. A quiet shift moved through the gallery, not a murmur this time, but something deeper, a collective recognition that the dynamic in the room had changed. The court clerk paused her typing for just a second, glancing up before returning to her work. The attorney adjusted his cuff, a small gesture that revealed more than he intended, his earlier composure now carefully maintained rather than natural. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered her words, the authority in his posture still present, but no longer absolute. He turned a page again, this time more slowly, scanning the text as if searching for something he had not expected to need. Counsel, he said, shifting his attention to the attorney, address the issue of notice directly. The instruction was simple, but its implication was unmistakable. The attorney hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before responding. Your Honor, while the notice requirement exists, its interpretation allows for flexibility under certain administrative conditions. Specified where? Emily's voice entered again, not interrupting, but precisely timed, her question landing cleanly in the space between his words. The attorney stopped. The room stilled. Judge Holloway's eyes moved between them, the tension now fully visible, no longer hidden beneath formality. Emily held her position, her expression calm, her presence steady, no longer fading into the background but defining the moment itself. What had begun as a quiet defense was no longer defensive at all. It had become something else entirely, something controlled, deliberate, and unmistakably powerful. And for the first time since the hearing began, the authority in the room did not feel one-sided. It felt contested. The room went silent. The question hung in the air with a sharpness that could not be ignored, and for the first time since the hearing began, the opposing attorney did not have an immediate answer ready. He shifted slightly, glancing down at his notes, then back up toward Judge Holloway, as if searching for a foothold that no longer felt stable beneath him. "Your Honor," he began again, his tone measured but noticeably tighter. "The administrative guidelines provide discretionary interpretation under certain operational constraints, which would allow for flexibility in how notice is applied." His words were carefully chosen, but the certainty behind them had thinned, replaced by something more cautious. Emily did not rush to respond. She allowed the explanation to unfold completely, her stillness now carrying a different weight, no longer passive but deliberate, as if she were mapping each word against something already known. Then she spoke, her voice calm, her delivery precise. "The guidelines you are referencing," she said, "are subordinate to the statutory requirement outlined in Section 4.2, which explicitly defines notice as a prerequisite, not a variable condition." The distinction landed cleanly, and the effect was immediate. The attorney's composure wavered again, just slightly, his prepared rhythm disrupted by the clarity of her response. Judge Holloway leaned forward, his attention fully engaged now, no longer observing from a position of assumed control, but actively weighing each statement. "Counsel," he said, his tone firmer than before, "identify the provision that allows for that discretionary interpretation." The instruction carried an expectation that could not be sidestepped. The attorney hesitated, flipping through his documents with more urgency than he intended to show, the soft rustle of paper breaking the quiet tension that had settled over the room. A few seconds passed, then more, each one stretching longer than the last. In the gallery, the earlier amusement had disappeared entirely, replaced by a focused silence, the kind that forms when certainty begins to unravel. Emily remained still, her gaze steady, her hands resting lightly against the table, her presence no longer overshadowed by the setting but anchoring it. The attorney finally looked up, his expression controlled but strained. "Your Honor," he said, "the interpretation is derived from administrative precedent rather than a specific clause within the statute." The admission was subtle, but its impact was not. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly, the shift in his expression reflecting a change that could not be reversed. He turned his attention back to Emily, studying her now with a level of scrutiny that acknowledged what had become undeniable. "Ms. Carter," he said slowly, "do you have further clarification on this point?" Emily inclined her head once more, her response ready, but not rushed. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "Administrative precedent cannot override statutory language, especially when the statute defines a mandatory condition. Without proper notice, the enforcement action lacks legal standing." The words settled into the room with a finality that silenced any remaining doubt. The attorney did not interrupt this time. He did not attempt to redirect or reframe. He simply stood there, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness that mirrored the room itself. Judge Holloway leaned back again, his fingers pressing together, his gaze lowering briefly to the documents before him, then lifting once more. The authority he carried was still present, but it no longer felt unquestioned. Something had shifted, something precise and irreversible, and it was now clear to everyone in that courtroom that the quiet woman who had been expected to falter was not merely keeping up. She was leading. The room went silent. Judge Holloway did not speak for several seconds, and in a courtroom where every second was usually accounted for, that silence carried more weight than any ruling. He lowered his gaze once more, scanning the statute in front of him with a level of attention that had been absent at the start of the hearing, his pen now resting motionless between his fingers. Across the room, the opposing attorney stood rigid, his earlier confidence replaced by a controlled stillness, as if any unnecessary movement might expose the uncertainty he was working to conceal. The gallery remained completely quiet, the shift in atmosphere so complete that even the smallest sound felt out of place. Emily Carter remained exactly where she was, her posture steady, her expression calm, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply holding the ground she had already established. Judge Holloway finally leaned forward, placing the pen down with deliberate care before speaking, his voice no longer carrying the same dismissive edge it once had. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone measured, "you have made a compelling argument regarding the procedural requirement of notice." The acknowledgement was subtle but unmistakable, and it moved through the room like a quiet realization. The attorney shifted slightly, as if preparing to respond, but the judge raised a hand just enough to pause him. "Before we proceed further," Judge Holloway continued, "I would like to examine the timeline of events as they relate to the notice requirement." His words signaled a shift in direction, one that no longer favored assumption, but demanded verification. Emily inclined her head slightly, her response immediate but composed. "Of course, Your Honor," she said. "The timeline is documented in the records submitted to the court, and it clearly shows that no written notice was delivered within the required time frame." Her voice remained steady, but there was a quiet confidence beneath it now, not newly discovered, but finally visible. Judge Holloway turned to the documents again, flipping through the pages with deliberate focus, his earlier certainty replaced by careful examination. "Counsel," he said without looking up, "confirm the date of the alleged notice delivery." The attorney hesitated, then answered, his voice controlled but no longer effortless. "The notice was issued on March 15th, Your Honor." Judge Holloway's eyes moved across the page, then stopped. "Issued," he repeated slowly, "but not delivered within the statutory period." It was not a question. It was a statement. The attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again, the response he had prepared no longer fitting the reality in front of him. A subtle shift passed through the gallery, not a murmur, but a shared understanding that the foundation of the argument had begun to collapse. Emily did not speak. She did not need to. The silence now worked in her favor, reinforcing what had already been made clear. Judge Holloway leaned back once more, his expression no longer that of a man in control of a predictable outcome, but of someone recalculating in real time. His gaze lifted, meeting Emily's with a new level of recognition, one that acknowledged not just her argument, but her command of it. "It appears," he said carefully, "that the procedural requirement was not satisfied." The words settled into the room with quiet finality. The attorney lowered his gaze, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by a stillness that mirrored the room itself. And in that moment, without raised voices or dramatic gestures, the balance of power had fully shifted. The quiet woman who had entered unnoticed now stood at the center of the courtroom, not as a target, but as the one who had redefined the entire proceeding. The room went silent. The weight of Judge Holloway's words lingered in the air, and for a brief moment, no one moved, as if the courtroom itself needed time to adjust to what had just been acknowledged. The authority that once felt absolute now carried hesitation, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. The opposing attorney shifted again, this time more visibly, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table before he stepped forward, determined not to let the moment settle without resistance. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "even if the notice was not delivered within the exact statutory timeframe, there remains the issue of intent and compliance, which could justify the enforcement under broader administrative discretion." His words were deliberate, an attempt to regain structure, to rebuild what had begun to fracture. But the confidence behind them no longer filled the room the way it had before. Emily Carter listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and when he finished, she did not respond immediately. The pause stretched again, but this time it felt different, not uncertain, but measured, as if she were allowing the argument to fully reveal its weaknesses before addressing it. Judge Holloway looked toward her, waiting, his earlier impatience replaced by expectation. "Ms. Carter," he said, "your response." Emily inclined her head slightly, her voice calm as she began. "Intent does not replace requirement, Your Honor," she said. "The statute does not provide exceptions based on administrative convenience or interpretation of intent. It establishes a clear condition that must be met before enforcement can occur." Her words were simple, but their precision cut through the room with quiet authority. The attorney opened his mouth to respond again, but Emily continued, not raising her voice, not interrupting, but guiding the moment forward with clarity. If the court allows enforcement without meeting that condition, she added, it sets a precedent that undermines the statute itself, making compliance optional rather than mandatory. The implications settled heavily, not just on the case, but on the broader system the courtroom represented. Judge Holloway's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of the weight behind her statement. He leaned forward again, his attention fully fixed on Emily now, no longer dividing his focus between assumption and analysis. You are suggesting, he said slowly, that allowing this action to proceed would conflict with established legal standards. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, because the law is not defined by intention alone, but by the conditions it requires to be valid. The room remained completely still, the earlier dynamics now fully reversed. The attorney lowered his eyes briefly, then looked back up, but this time he did not speak. There was nothing immediate to counter, no simple way to reframe what had already been laid out with such clarity. Judge Holloway leaned back once more, his fingers pressing together as he considered the implications, his authority still present, but no longer unquestioned. The shift was no longer subtle. It was complete. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the courtroom that this was no longer a matter of one side presenting and the other responding. It had become a matter of truth being defined in real time, and the person defining it was no longer the one who had started with the power. The room went silent. Judge Holloway remained still for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the documents before him, but it was clear to everyone in the room that he was no longer reading for confirmation, he was reading for resolution. The authority that once defined his presence had shifted into something quieter, more deliberate, as though every word he considered now carried consequences beyond this single case. The opposing attorney stood motionless, his earlier attempts to regain control fading into silence, his posture no longer projecting certainty but restraint. Emily Carter did not move. She did not press forward or attempt to fill the silence. She simply stood, composed, as if she understood that the most powerful moment was not in speaking, but in allowing the truth already presented to settle fully. Judge Holloway finally lifted his gaze, his expression measured, his voice steady but changed. The court has reviewed the statutory requirements and the timeline of events. He began, each word deliberate, each pause intentional. It is clear that the procedural condition of proper notice was not satisfied within the required time frame. The statement was direct, but its impact moved through the room like a quiet wave, reaching every corner, settling into every observer. No one reacted outwardly, but the shift was undeniable. The attorney lowered his eyes, his earlier arguments now, without foundation, his presence reduced to stillness. Judge Holloway continued, his tone firm, no longer dismissive, no longer performative. Without fulfillment of this requirement, the enforcement action lacks the legal basis necessary to proceed. The words were final, leaving no space for reinterpretation, no room for recovery. A subtle breath seemed to release across the room, not loud, not visible, but felt, as if a tension that had been building from the very beginning had finally been resolved. Emily remained calm, her expression unchanged, not displaying triumph, not seeking recognition, simply present in the outcome she had already understood before it was spoken. Judge Holloway paused briefly, his gaze shifting toward her once more, and for the first time since the hearing began, there was no trace of condescension in his expression, only acknowledgement. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice quieter now, but clear, your understanding of the statute and its application has been noted. It was not an apology, but it was something close, something that carried weight in a room where words defined reality. The courtroom remained silent, the earlier imbalance now completely gone, replaced by a stillness that reflected not tension, but recognition. The clerk resumed typing, the soft sound of keys returning as the formal record caught up with what had already been decided. The attorney gathered his documents slowly, no longer rushing, no longer asserting, simply accepting. Emily adjusted her papers with the same quiet precision she had shown from the beginning, her movements unchanged, as if nothing about her had shifted, even though everything around her had. Judge Holloway leaned back slightly, his posture composed, but no longer elevated above the moment, no longer distant from it. The authority of the room had not disappeared, but it had been redefined. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, it became clear that what had unfolded was not just a ruling, but a correction, one that restored balance not through force, but through clarity. The room went silent. People did not rush to leave when the hearing concluded, even though the formal proceedings had clearly ended, and that in itself said more than any spoken reaction could have. The courtroom, which had once been filled with quiet judgment and subtle amusement, now held a different kind of silence, one shaped by reflection rather than expectation. Emily Carter gathered her documents slowly, aligning each page with the same careful precision she had shown from the very beginning, her movements calm and unhurried, as if the outcome had never been in question for her. Around her, small details began to shift. The court clerk, who had barely glanced in her direction earlier, now looked up briefly as Emily passed, offering a subtle nod that carried quiet respect. The opposing attorney avoided eye contact, his earlier confidence replaced by a reserved stillness, as though he understood that nothing he could say now would alter what had already been established. Judge Holloway remained seated for a moment longer than usual, his hands resting on the bench, his gaze following Emily as she prepared to leave. There was no announcement, no formal acknowledgement beyond what had already been spoken, but something in his expression had changed, something that suggested a recognition deeper than procedure. He had entered the courtroom expecting control, expecting to guide the narrative as he always had, but what he encountered instead was a reminder that authority alone does not define understanding. Emily reached the aisle and paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but as if acknowledging the space she was leaving behind, a space that no longer viewed her the same way it had when she first walked in. The observers in the gallery shifted slightly, some lowering their eyes, others watching with a quiet curiosity that had replaced their earlier assumptions. No one spoke. No one needed to. The lesson had already unfolded in full. As Emily stepped toward the exit, the sound of her footsteps was soft against the polished floor, steady and even, carrying no urgency, no need to prove anything further. Outside the courtroom, the noise of the building resumed, distant voices, the movement of people, the ordinary rhythm of a place that handled countless cases without pause. But inside that room, something had been corrected, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that left no doubt. Judge Holloway finally stood, his posture composed, but his presence no longer untouched by what had occurred. He glanced once more at the documents on his bench, then toward the now empty space where Emily had stood. For a brief moment, the room held that silence again, not tense, not uncertain, but settled. And in that stillness, one truth remained undeniable. Respect had not been demanded. It had been revealed. And that day, without raising her voice, without changing who she was, Emily Carter had reminded everyone in that courtroom that the law is not upheld by power alone, but by those who understand it well enough to stand their ground when it matters most. The room went silent.